In 1802, the Spanish colonial government of Puerto Rico sat down, opened the official census, and wrote something that would shape history for the next 200 years. Where the 1787 census had listed 2,300 native people living on the island, the 1802 census listed exactly 0, not 1. In the space of 15 years, an entire people had been declared gone. No war, no documented mass death, no recorded catastrophe of any kind in that specific period. They simply vanished from the paperwork, and for 200 years, the world accepted that disappearance as fact. Then science came for the paperwork. And what DNA found inside the bodies of living Puerto Ricans today did not just challenge the official story, it demolished it, completely, methodically, number by number, haplogroup by haplogroup, genome by genome. The Taíno people were never extinct. They were erased on paper by the same colonial system that enslaved them, and they survived in the blood of millions of people who were told for generations that their indigenous ancestors did not exist. This is the story of the biggest identity lie ever told about an entire population. And it is still being untold right now in laboratories, in DNA databases and Facebook groups where Puerto Ricans from New York to San Juan post their ancestry results and stare at the numbers that tell them what their grandmothers always whispered was true. Let me take you back to before the lie, before 1493, before Columbus, before any of it. The island that is now called Puerto Rico was known to its people as Puerto Rican. It sat at the eastern edge of the Greater Antilles, a mountainous island of rivers and rainforests and extraordinary fertility. The people who lived there called themselves Taíno, and they were by any honest accounting one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Caribbean. They lived in organized villages called yucayeques, governed by leaders called caciques, who could be either men or women. They practiced advanced agriculture, growing cassava, maize, sweet potato, peanuts, and tobacco. They made ceramic pottery, carved intricate wooden objects, wore elaborate jewelry of gold and shell, and played a ball game called Beatty on specially constructed stone courts that still exist on the island today. They had a cosmology, a detailed understanding of the stars, a system of storytelling and memory through carved symbols called petroglyphs that can still be found on cave walls and river stones across Puerto Rico. They were not primitive. They were not simple. They were a people with thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how to live on their specific piece of the earth. Estimates of the Taíno population across the Caribbean at the time of European contact range from 1 million to 3 million people. In Puerto Rico alone, somewhere between 30,000 and 500,000, Taíno people were living on Puerto Rican when Columbus arrived in 1493. The range in those estimates is itself a reflection of how chaotic and catastrophic what followed was. Nobody had time to count carefully. Things moved too fast and too brutally for accurate records. The Spanish arrived with 3 things the Taíno had never encountered: steel weapons, horses, and diseases against which the indigenous population had 0 immunity. Within the first 30 years of contact, between 80 and 90% of the Taíno population was dead. Smallpox, influenza, and measles swept through communities that had no biological defense. The survivors were forced into gold mines and agricultural labor under a system called the encomienda, which was slavery dressed up in legal language. Those who resisted were killed. Those who fled into the mountains were hunted. By 1514, less than 20 years after Columbus, the Taíno population had been reduced to approximately 32,000 people across the entire Caribbean. By 1565, Spanish documents record only 200 indigenous people on the island of Hispaniola. So the colonial administration created new labels: mestizo, pardo, mulatto, free person of color. Each of these labels described a mixed heritage but denied a specific indigenous one. A child born to a Taíno mother and a Spanish father was recorded as mestizo. A child born to a Taíno woman and an African man was recorded as pardo. The word Taíno stopped appearing in birth records. It stopped appearing in church documents. It stopped appearing in anything because the administrative system simply did not allow for it anymore. This is what historians now call paper genocide. The term was coined and popularized by Jorge Baracute Estevez, a Taíno community leader who spent years documenting how an entire people was removed from official existence, not through total physical elimination, but through deliberate bureaucratic erasure. Paper genocide means that a people can be made to disappear on paper. And once something disappears from the official record, it takes on a reality of its own. Scholars cite the census. Textbooks repeat what the census says. Students learn the story the census tells. Generation after generation, the lie compounds. By 1802, as we began, the census said 0, not 1 Indian in all of Puerto Rico, and that 0 became the foundation of a historical narrative taught in schools, repeated in encyclopedias, stated confidently in textbooks across the Americas and Europe for the next 200 years. The Taíno were extinct. Columbus's arrival had been so catastrophic that an entire civilization had been wiped from the face of the earth within a century. A tragic history, certainly. A clean one, at least. A closed one. Except the grandmothers knew better. Across Puerto Rico, across the Puerto Rican diaspora in New York and Chicago and Florida and everywhere else the island's people had scattered, there were families who kept a different story. Grandmothers who talked about Indian blood. Old people who knew which plants healed which illnesses and where that knowledge came from. Families with facial features, with particular ways of doing things, with words in their vocabulary that were not Spanish and not African, that came from somewhere else, from before. These oral traditions were dismissed for decades. Academics who heard them were polite but skeptical. The census said 0. The history book said extinct. What could grandmothers know that the official record did not? As it turns out, everything. The first major scientific challenge to the extinction myth came in 2003. Dr. Juan Martinez Cruzado, a geneticist at the University of Puerto Rico Mayagüez, had spent years designing an island-wide DNA survey of the Puerto Rican population. When the results came in, funded by the United States National Science Foundation, they were staggering. 61% of all Puerto Ricans tested showed evidence of Native American mitochondrial DNA. Not 2%, not 5%, 61%. Mitochondrial DNA is passed exclusively from mother to child, unchanged through the female line. It traces the maternal ancestry with extraordinary precision. And in 61% of Puerto Ricans, that maternal line went back not to Spain, not to Africa, but to indigenous women of the Caribbean. When Martinez Cruzado tested specifically for the Y chromosome, the genetic marker passed only through the male line, the result was almost exactly reversed. Taíno DNA appeared in barely 1% of male ancestral lines. The meaning of that asymmetry is not subtle. The Spanish colonizers who arrived in Puerto Rico were almost entirely men. They reproduced with Taíno women. The Taíno men were overwhelmingly killed, enslaved, or died from disease. The Taíno women survived, and their genetic heritage flowed forward through every subsequent generation. The island was officially recorded as having no Indians, but 61% of its people carried the maternal DNA of indigenous women in every cell of their bodies. Then, in 2018, the science went further. Much further. A team of researchers led by Dr. Hannes Schroeder of the University of Copenhagen, working within an international research project called Nexus, or 3292, managed to do something that had seemed technically impossible. Tropical heat and humidity destroy ancient DNA. The conditions of the Caribbean are among the worst in the world for preserving genetic material in old bones. But a tooth found in a cave on the small Bahamian island of Eleuthera, recovered from a female skeleton, had preserved something extraordinary. The woman had lived somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries, at least 500 years before Columbus ever left Spain. Her DNA was intact enough to sequence. Schroeder's team sequenced her full genome, the first complete ancient human genome ever recovered from the Caribbean. They then compared her DNA against genetic databases of over 40 modern indigenous groups from across the Americas, and against the genomes of 104 contemporary Puerto Ricans from the International 1000 Genomes Project. The results were published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. The supposed extinct people were not extinct. They were living in millions of people who had spent 2 centuries being told their indigenous ancestry was a myth, a romantic fantasy, an embarrassing claim that serious historians did not support. The numbers kept building. The average genetic composition of contemporary Puerto Ricans, when measured across all modern studies, is approximately 64% European, 21% African, and 15% Native American, with the Native American component now confirmed as specifically Taíno, rather than from any mainland indigenous group. That 15% number might sound modest until you put it in context. There are currently 3.5 million people living in Puerto Rico, and another 5.5 million people of Puerto Rican descent living on the mainland United States. That is 9 million people. 15% of 9 million is 1,350,000 people walking around right now carrying Taíno DNA in every cell of their bodies. And that is just the nuclear DNA number. The mitochondrial number, which traces the maternal line specifically, runs as high as 61%. The Taíno were never extinct. They were always here. The difference is that now we can prove it in a way that no census can argue with and no colonial administrator can revise. But here is what makes this story more than a scientific correction to a historical error. Here is what makes it matter right now in 2026 for living people. When the Puerto Rican census first included an indigenous self-identification option, 33,000 people identified as Indian. 33,000 people who had been waiting for an official box that reflected what their families had always known. The Puerto Rican island is currently in the midst of a genuine cultural reclamation movement. Taíno language classes are being taught online and draw thousands of followers. In some Puerto Rican schools, Taíno words are now taught alongside Spanish. Children play Beatty, the traditional Taíno ball game, during school recess, Organizations like the Taíno Jatibonicu tribe, the United Confederation of the Taíno people, and the Guatumacu Aborican Puerto Rico people are working to preserve and rebuild what centuries of colonial erasure tried to destroy. Priscilla Colon, whose work has become internationally recognized, spent 20 years developing Taíno language programs and now serves as co-chair of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, a global preservation effort for endangered and suppressed indigenous languages. The Taíno language, which was declared dead, is being reconstructed from the words that survived in place names and the names of plants and animals, in the vocabulary that Puerto Ricans use every day without realizing where it comes from. Think about the words: hammock, hurricane, barbecue, canoe, tobacco, cannibal, savanna. All Taíno words. All words that passed from the Taíno language into Spanish, and from Spanish into English, and eventually into virtually every language on Earth. You have been using the Taíno language for your entire life without knowing it, because the people who spoke it were declared extinct, because it was easier for a colonial system built on erasure to say gone than to say transformed and survived and still here. The resistance was never just genetic. It was cultural. It was carried forward in the knowledge of which plants cured which fevers, knowledge that Taíno women passed to their children and their grandchildren in a line that runs unbroken from before Columbus to the present day. It was carried in the memory of which rivers were sacred, which mountains had meaning, which stories explained the relationship between human beings and the specific piece of earth they lived on. Puerto Ricans, who identified as having indigenous ancestry, were often mocked, told they were romanticizing, told they were claiming a heritage that no longer existed for the comfort of it rather than the truth of it. The DNA does not allow for that dismissal anymore. There's also a political dimension to this that cannot be ignored. The United States, which has administered Puerto Rico as a territory since 1898, has never recognized any Taíno group as an indigenous people under federal law. There are no federally recognized Taíno tribes. There are no land rights, no sovereign status, no legal indigenous identity of any kind. While mainland Native American tribes who survived colonization with more documentation and more political organization have had varying degrees of legal recognition through centuries of treaty law and federal policy, the Taíno have had nothing. The paper genocide that erased them from colonial census records in 1802 has continued in a different form through American administrative law for the past 128 years. The DNA evidence is beginning to change that conversation too. When people can walk into a discussion about indigenous rights and produce peer-reviewed genetic evidence published in PNAS and Nature showing that they are the biological descendants of the pre-contact population of the island, the argument that there are no indigenous people in Puerto Rico becomes extremely difficult to sustain. It does not automatically translate into legal recognition or political rights. Nothing in American law is that simple, but it changes what is possible to claim and what can no longer be easily dismissed. There's a woman named Mercedes Garcia who grew up hearing from her grandmother that they were Taíno, that no matter where she was, that was who she was. She later read in an encyclopedia that the Taíno were extinct, and she said it broke her heart to read that her people were gone. Then she took a DNA test and found what the science has now confirmed for millions of others. The grandmother was right. The encyclopedia was wrong. The census was the lie. The blood was the truth. That story, multiplied across 9 million people, is what the DNA evidence means when it is translated from science into human experience. It is not just a correction to a historical footnote. It is the restoration of an identity that an entire colonial system worked for 500 years to erase. It is the validation of every grandmother who kept telling the story when the official record said there was no story to tell. The Taíno survived the genocide. They survived the paper genocide that followed. They survived the denial and the mockery and the textbooks and the encyclopedias, and 2 centuries of being told their own ancestry was a fantasy. They survived because survival is what you do when you have nowhere to go and everything to lose. They survived in the mitochondrial DNA of 61% of Puerto Ricans. They survived in the 15% Taíno genome component carried by millions of people across 2 countries. They survived in the words that crossed the ocean and entered every language on Earth. They survived in the knowledge of plants and rivers and mountains, passed forward in whispers, when the official record said there was no one left to whisper. The 1802 census said 0. The science says otherwise. And the grandmothers, as it turns out, were right all along. And this reclamation is happening in the most unexpected places, in ways that are hard to predict and impossible to stop once they begin. Take what happened when DNA testing companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe first started becoming widely affordable and accessible to the general public. Puerto Ricans began ordering the kits in enormous numbers. And what they found sent shockwaves through Facebook groups and family WhatsApp chats and dinner table conversations across the diaspora. People who had been told their entire lives that they were simply Spanish, or simply a mix of Spanish and African, were opening their results and finding something labeled Caribbean, Indigenous, or Native American, ranging from 5% to 20% to, in some cases, much higher. And then they were posting the screenshots, thousands of them. And other Puerto Ricans were looking at those screenshots and recognizing the same numbers in their own results and asking the same question. Why did nobody tell us this? The answer to that question, of course, is that the colonial system told them the opposite. That the educational system built on that colonial story repeated the opposite. That every official document, every history book, every encyclopedia entry that declared the Taíno extinct in the 16th century became a wall between millions of living people and their own ancestry. But there is something even more specific and more troubling about how this erasure was maintained. It was not just passive. It was not just the result of outdated records persisting because nobody bothered to update them. There were active choices made, at specific historical moments, to ensure that Indigenous identity in Puerto Rico remained officially invisible. When Spanish colonial authorities removed the Indigenous category from the census after 1802, that was a decision. Someone sat down and decided that the remaining people of Indigenous heritage would henceforth be classified as something else. When American authorities took over the island after 1898 and designed their own census categories, limiting options to Hispanic, white, black, or mixed, that was a decision too, a decision that continued the erasure by different hands. The United States did not invent the paper genocide, but it inherited it and maintained it. Every census that offered no Indigenous option to Puerto Ricans was a renewal of the original lie. And the consequence of that lie extended beyond identity into something more material. When Taíno community groups in Puerto Rico attempted to assert their Indigenous identity and rights in the early 2000s, they were met not with skepticism, but with open hostility. In August 2005, 3 community leaders representing Indigenous organizations were arrested in the mountain region of Utuado after a 17-day hunger strike. They were protesting the government's desecration of sacred sites and ancestral remains and demanding recognition of their identity and rights as Indigenous peoples. The Puerto Rican Institute of Culture flatly denied the legitimacy of their groups. The response from official institutions was not to engage with their claims, but to dismiss them entirely as illegitimate, as fiction, as embarrassing romanticization. This was 3 years before the 2018 PNAS study that proved the genetic continuity between ancient Taíno and modern Puerto Ricans. Those protesters did not have the genomic data yet, but they had exactly the same claim, and they were arrested for it. The science does not undo what was done to those people. It does not restore the sacred sites that were desecrated or give back the years of dismissal or compensate for the generations of Puerto Ricans who grew up without the ability to name their full ancestry. What the science does is make the dismissal no longer available as an option. You cannot look at the PNAS study and say that no one in Puerto Rico has Taíno ancestry. You cannot look at the 61% mitochondrial DNA figure from the National Science Foundation funded research and call it romantic fantasy. You cannot look at the result that every single one of 164 Puerto Ricans matched the ancient Taíno genome and tell those people their grandmothers were making it up. The ancient woman in Preacher's Cave in the Bahamas died between 800 and 1,000 years before any European ship reached the Caribbean. She was buried in a cave on a small island. Her tooth survived tropical conditions that destroy most ancient DNA because the specific chemistry of that cave preserved what should have been long gone. And when researchers sequenced her genome 1,000 years after her death and compared it to the DNA of living Puerto Ricans, the match was closer than any other population on Earth. She is their ancestor. And they are her descendants. And no census, no colonial authority, no administrative reclassification, no declaration of extinction can change what is written in the molecules of their own bodies. There are Taíno words you use right now without knowing it. When you sleep in a hammock, you are using a Taíno word. When you talk about a hurricane, you are using a Taíno word. When someone lights up a barbecue, that is a Taíno word. When you paddle a canoe, when you smoke tobacco, when you eat food grown from a savanna, you are speaking fragments of a language that the colonial record declared dead. The language moved through the world because the people who spoke it moved through the world. They did not disappear. They mixed and survived and passed their words and their knowledge and their genes forward into every subsequent generation. The story that was told for 200 years was a convenient story. It was a story that served the interests of a colonial system that needed the people it had destroyed to stay destroyed on paper, because acknowledging their survival would mean acknowledging obligations to land, to identity, to the simple recognition that what was taken had been taken from someone. What DNA is doing now with a precision and a permanence that no census can revise is making that convenient story impossible to maintain. The molecules do not forget what the documents erased. The haplogroups do not know that they were supposed to be gone by 1802. The genome of a woman who died before Columbus was born does not know that her people were declared extinct 500 years after her death. The science is clear. The numbers are published. The studies are peer-reviewed and internationally recognized. The Taíno people were never extinct. They were living, as they had always been living, in the blood of the island they called Puerto Rican. And after 500 years of being told otherwise, the grandmothers are finally being proven right. The 1802 census wrote 0. The DNA writes millions. And that number is not going back into the box. The science is done arguing with the paperwork. And after 5 centuries of silence, the ancestors are finally being counted. There are 9 million reasons the story needed to be corrected, one for every living person who carries that ancestry in their blood today.